Hey, everybody, we're the good doctors of Abbey Research. I'm Dr. Kristen.
And I'm Dr. Erin.
You are exceptionally welcome to our conversation today and all days, to be honest. Here at Abbey Research, we are big believers that empathy is an intellectual exercise and not really an emotion, as much as we kind of say it is. Instead, it's understanding how we move through the world to welcome other people's worldviews into our own. Don't understand what we mean? Hang around and we'll explain. So we have conversations about culture from our perspective as two PhDs in social science that have been taught to analyze systems and cultures and people and how all of those things interact across a couple pretty good universities and a lot of experience in doing it. We have conversations on this channel, podcast, wherever you are talking and listening to us around everything from why flags matter so much to people, to how you find what we can learn from Hallmark Christmas movies. And we do it all together all the time. We talk to each other a lot, but we really love it when you guys talk back. So we've turned on the recording devices for you to hear what you think about our thoughts and comments. So please never hesitate to share them.
This video is a part of our ongoing series where, we try and figure out what we can learn from streaming content. We love to talk about films and documentaries. We are in our special Olympic coverage as it is the month of August, and we're into out of the Olympics and into the Paralympic time of our every 4-year summer celebration of all things Olympics. And if you've joined our coverage so far, we're kind of seesawing between the celebratory and the important, but maybe not so happy pieces of art that have to do with the Olympics. We're seesawing back to the quasi-celebratory, quasi-upsetting side with the 2016 documentary More Than Gold, Jesse Owens and the 1936 Olympics, which is available for your streaming pleasure on the Peacock. It's narrated by Morgan Freeman. It tells the story of Jesse Owens and race and the 1936 Olympics and Nazi Germany and the Second World War and a whole bunch of things. It's 48 minutes of sports documentary perfection. It ends with Andra Day singing to me, which is how every documentary should end. And boy, did we learn a lot from this one. Dr. Kristen, where would you like to start?
So the Olympic torch relay was designed by Adolf Hitler as a piece of Nazi propaganda because he designed the entire 1936 Olympics as a piece of Nazi propaganda. It even sounds like some of the way that the opening ceremonies have happened heretofore with the marching and the way we do the entrance of the athletes and everything else is he had some hands in that.
Is Hitler-esque.
We got some Hitler-esque drums going on. Also, just a quick reminder that the founder, the guy who founded the modern Olympics in 1890, whatever, the reason we rebirthed the Olympics was to remind everybody how great white people are. So
yeah, he was a eugenicist who wanted to display the superiority of white humans.
Which is why things like sailing and shooting and Northern European and Scandinavian sports are the ones that ended up in the first batch of Olympic-y things. So we say all of this as lovers of the Olympics and believers in its demonstration of human potential, but also that we all need to be taught a little bit more about the facts behind the Olympics, like that the torch relay was a piece of Nazi propaganda. So real glad I know that now.
Same.
Real glad. I'm glad they spent as much time in the archival footage as they did, physically showing how Hitler interacted with people. And I mean, like, he was exactly, I don't know. Oh, what did I say to you? And I'm so used to him being like an icon of something that when somebody shows him talking, like, I forget that he was a human person.
Yeah. And I forget that we have footage of it. Right.
Yeah.
Like, cause it's a fascinating thing that we do to ourselves when we, only show things in black and white, and we, like the way we freeze things in the historic past by how we talk about them and visually represent them. Yeah, like the moving footage of him like speaking, and I had to think to myself, I was like, did we have video footage of Hitler speaking? Because I'm like, it was so long ago, right? That like we kind of forget what was available and what we have and what we know of him. So yeah, no, I'd agree. I was like, whoa, he moved.
There's a part where like I don't want to hear his speeches, but at the same time, like every once in a while more, I would like people to play what he sounded like when we talk about him, so that I can remember that like all of Germany didn't just wake up one morning and decide to follow this guy. Like he was good at what he did, and he was a really powerful orator.
And he had been at it for a long time. I think he starts showing up speaking at like places around Germany in like 1920.
Yeah, like he was for a hot minute before he got to the Third Reich. And
yeah,
there's also a lot, like I've actually listened to a podcast once where they were talking about neurolinguistic programming and like how you do speeches. And there are two examples where Hitler and Trump, like very legitimately, like how you get people to agree with you and follow you. So it was fascinating. I was glad to hear his voice because I hadn't in many, many years, except for the mocking ones that we do when people dub Hitler in the movies.
Yeah.
And I forgot that's not what he sounded like. So there's that. I also appreciated that we got to see Jesse Owens.
Mm-hmm.
I appreciated how much archival footage there was, full stop. Like, can we talk about the U.S. athletes' cruise across the Atlantic?
The Olympic cruise on the SS Manhattan. Oh my gosh. That was amazing. Like I would just watch those films for days. So good. And I love that they found like 3 athletes who at the time of filming this had competed in the 36 Olympics to give like context to it, because Jesse Owens died, as they tell you in the film, in 1980. So yeah. Oh, that cruise looked like the absolute crack.
It's also just really fun because they were showing pictures of them like as Olympians.
Yeah.
And like we often talk about the Olympics as a little bit of a thirst trap, like in modern parlance. And I was like, 1936 Kristen and Erin would have quite enjoyed Adolf Kiefer.
Yeah.
Plus we quite enjoy him as a human now. He was a hoot.
He was a delightful human. I love that, like, that I learned that more Navy sailors died from drowning than bullets, and that he made a career teaching naval officers how to swim.
So proud of him. On the other side, it was really a good reminder that World War II happened concurrently, because like the German athlete who became at least visually friendly with Jesse Owens on the track was then killed in action.
Yeah.
And a reminder of, first of all, the Olympics are always political.
Always.
The sport is always political. But the way that at this particular junction, how many of those people would have gone on to other Olympic games, who would have helped develop more sport in their country, who would have, that legacy was truncated by the Second World War. And I'm sure if we went back to the 1904 Olympics or whatever, we would have the same thing with World War I. We don't, obviously, with the death of the draft, don't see that. And I would imagine a lot of athletes got draft exemptions in Vietnam, because we at that point were so obsessed with the gold medal count of it all. I would think the World War II was the last time where we really had that kind of brain drain, as it were. In how it happened. So that was a little bit sobering on that front, like this reminder that these are human bodies that did all of this in a way that I hadn't thought about it in a minute.
And that they exist outside the Olympics, right? Because we never hear about them outside of the Olympics, hardly ever, unless they make the news for something not great. And we talked about this when we covered the Weight of Gold documentary, that they feel like they disappear as humans, and that they're only really relevant for the time that they're competing on the international stage. But it was great to see that context and to see what they did after the Olympics. I think it was fascinating to see how upset American politicians were at the racist, fascist Nazi government. And
we had the KKK riding roughshod through most of our country at the time. So
yeah, so the fact that like it didn't even occur to me that we should boycott the 36 games, but obviously that conversation would have happened because Hitler was being Hitler, just not quite peak Hitler yet. And so the part in the documentary where they were talking about the boycott, and then they were like, well, we really should boycott the games because of how awful the Nazi government is. And I was like, says the people who lynch folks? Like, I was like, is this still the Jim Crow era and segregated education and segregated life? So
it says the blueprint for the apartheid government. Like,
okay.
Okay. We've always been so good as a nation of holding everybody else to a standard that we do not accept for ourselves. It's like one of our spiritual gifts as a nation.
Yeah. And like one of the notes that I wrote down was like, we've always loved to pretend that we weren't racist when we could benefit from the talent of Black folks.
Oh, for sure. And when we could
like them, like we can claim them
and be on the moral high ground. This is like the big British joke too, that when Andy Murray loses, he's Scottish, and when he wins, he's English.
Yeah. Or British. Yeah.
British. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I know. It was fascinating. And you and I both grew up loving sports and being sports fanatics and loving the intersection of sports and culture. I would like to talk for just a moment about the politics of the Olympic Games and how not great the U.S. Olympic Committee is at recognizing said politics at times. Our dear viewers will know that I was on vacation very recently in my hometown of Colorado Springs, which is the capital of Olympics in the United States. It's where the Olympic Training Center was built and continues to be run from. And we very recently opened a U.S. Olympic and Paralympic museum that I had the opportunity to tour with my family. And I was just chatting back and forth with my brother on Slack when I was watching this documentary. And I'm like, did you see anything about that torch being Hitler's idea? And he was like, nope. And they have a whole hall of torches that starts in 1936, interestingly enough.
Because it was invented in 1936.
Because it was invented in 1936. And they have a whole exhibit on political events that relate to the Olympics, including 1936. I'm remiss that I did not read that because I was so tired of the museum space at that point. I was like, not reading this. So they could have talked about the torch there. But I think it's always so interesting that we, in a larger societal discourse, like say that things aren't political when everything is political. Everything. Especially sports. Mm-hmm. And it's, we've heard this a lot in the last 5 or 6 years, especially because of Colin Kaepernick and the Black Lives Matter protests in professional sports, that like, I don't want my sports to be political. And like, they always have been, especially the Olympics. And in wondering now, watching this, I wish I would have watched this documentary before I went home and went to the museum, because like how much of the nationalist propaganda of the Olympic Games came from the Nazis, because it's always about, like, my memory is it's always about like showcasing the nation.
So it probably was, but I'm thinking back because we had some of that with the World Fair.
Yeah, and like that's where the first Olympic Games like came from. Like
was the St. Louis. I mean, not the first, but the first in America was out of the St. Louis World Fair.
Yeah.
The modern Olympics came back in like 1890, what have you.
Yes. And we're at the World Fair, and
we're at the World Fair.
Anthropology days and racist stuff like that.
And at that point, we were already good at propaganda.
Yeah.
And like arguably we were even better at it than we are now, because there were no naysayers. So I think if it's anything, it's a both and.
I think it's a both and too, because like the late 19th century and into the early 20th century is where we see this dramatic rise in nationalism. Yeah. And we get the creation of the idea of a nation.
Correct.
And that coincides with the conflict in the First World War and the splitting up of all the empires as these national identities emerge.
And in the United States, it's directly tied to the failure of Reconstruction and how we created a United States that essentially then had to include the Jim Crow South because of how we created the idea of America after Reconstruction.
Yeah. Yeah. And so this, intersection of nationalism and performative nationalism and invented traditions to showcase the nation is fascinating to me. And like, I want to go back and re-study the various Olympic Games through this lens.
No, and there's a new history of the Olympic Games that just came out, book publishing wise, that I have on hold in the library. So I may just end up getting it for us. We can both read it. But nice. The thing that I was thinking too is that this is as we're in the 1918, 1910, 19, which is when a lot of these athletes would have been like the 36 athletes are like born, right? They're you know, they're in the Steve Rogers generation, as I think of in my brain. This is also when we start to have the birth of football. Yeah. And like the coalition of baseball. So now we're also getting American masculinity through a sports lens.
Yeah.
And there
like
are
on a national level
we are beginning to understand that you can be an American man by being Davy Crockett, and you can also be an American man by being Lou Gehrig. And so like, how does this, and what does the Olympics say about that? And then I'm also very curious as to, there was a ladies swimming, I know, but I can't remember, an equestrian, but I can't remember the other sports that women were allowed to compete in 36. I don't know them.
Yeah, track and field, I think swimming and dressage, I would imagine.
Dressage. And I would not imagine there's a whole lot else.
Yeah, and like limited track and field.
Very limited track and field. So
what we ascribe to be appropriate performances of femininity. Yeah, it's
the history of gymnastics is that which I think we may have had in 36, but it was, I can't remember, but really what gymnastics was at that point was posing and dancing.
Yeah.
It had no athleticism whatsoever. It was entirely about dancing. We had men's gymnastics from the jump, but women's gymnastics was entirely about posing and dancing, and being a proper lady.
Yeah, and I think
that's so interesting.
This is we're tangentially rabbit holing pretty quickly on this, but I think.
Have you met us? Yeah.
Hi, welcome to the show. What I think is so great about what this documentary did in such a short time really was still encapsulate the intersection of race and athletic performance.
Yep.
So succinctly and so clearly. And like, it's not hard to tell this story because we have the documentary evidence of it. So we have the footage of Jesse Owens being adored by the German crowd, snubbed by Hitler, returning home and being stripped of his amateur status because he wanted to leave the European tour of Olympians a little bit early because he was tired and he wanted to see his wife, which is the most Simone Biles thing. So great to know that we keep doing the same thing when athletes say, I'm tired, I'd like a rest. And we're like, you're not a good enough person anymore, so we're going to take from you. Thankfully, no one's talking about stripping Simone Biles. No one's seriously talking of stripping Simone Biles of her achievements. But, we did that to Jim Thorpe as well, which was exceptionally racially motivated, and stripped him of his gold medals, ostensibly because he got paid to be a baseball player. But we all know it was racism that was motivating it. And so I really enjoyed that and enjoyed learning that and enjoyed watching that we were super racist. But like, it's not surprising to me that he came back to still a segregated America and was paraded around the country as this great American hero and forced to go in the back door of buildings and in through the Black entrance. And, we didn't even have the word Black back then, the colored entrance, was an American athlete when he was successful and was a Negro when he returned. And absolutely at all not surprised, but it's such a succinct and important way to have that conversation and to show the inherent contradictions of American propaganda, because that's what it was. We were showing that we were superior. We were showing that the Aryan myth was just that. When we had our own Aryan myth, it was called Jim Crow and racialized segregation and redlining and voting discrimination.
But we're big on myths. We're big on myths because what we're actually talking about next is another myth.
Heyo.
we're going to be discussing the movie Miracle,
Which
is a massive. So after we defeated the Aryan race myth, we then created the all communists are evil myth, which we then traded for all Muslims are evil myth. And we're hitting everybody is awful and we're all awful myth, which is a super fun one to live in right now.
Love it.
So as we talk about American myths and American propaganda, we're going to move on to Dr. Erin's favorite movie of the Olympic oeuvre. We're going to be talking about Disney's Miracle, which just as she loved Cool Runnings, I also love Miracle. We're just focusing on the one from each of our pantheons, as it were. And very, very excited to talk about truly, though, the power of myth, the power of propaganda, the power of the national identity, and what the Miracle on Ice really meant. And Dr. Erin's going to unpack a lot of that for us as our resident hockey aficionado and historian. So definitely tune in next time to kind of get even more of that, plus a great discussion of Kurt Russell's costumes, because we have to talk about those pants. Don't worry about it. And in the meantime, if you enjoyed this conversation, we would really appreciate a thumbs up. The YouTube algorithm is fairly obsessed with it. And if you like our conversations entirely, don't forget to subscribe and ring that bell so that you don't miss a single thing. If you're listening to this on the podcast, please rate and review and subscribe to wherever you are listening it so that we can essentially more folks can find out about us and more folks can participate in these conversations because we think they're important.
We do. We enjoyed this one. We hope you did too. If you haven't checked out More Than Gold, please do so post haste. And we are excited to talk to you about ice hockey and so much more next week.
See you guys then.
Bye.